It begins with something so quiet you barely notice it happening. A child reaches for comfort and finds empty air. They cry and learn that tears are inconvenient. They share excitement and meet blank stares. They express fear and hear that they're being dramatic. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, they begin to understand that their inner world is unwelcome. This is where trauma hides in plain sight. Not in the dramatic moments we typically associate with childhood wounds, but in the spaces between words, in the responses that never came, in the emotional desert of a house where feelings go to die. We think we understand trauma. We imagine it as something violent, something obvious, something that leaves visible scars. But the deepest wounds often come wrapped in silence. They arrive not through what was done, but through what was never done at all. A hug that never came. A conversation that was avoided. A tear that was dismissed. An achievement that was ignored. This is the invisible architecture of emotional neglect, and it shapes minds in ways that echo for decades. Before we go deeper, I just want to say something. Thank you, truly, for being here. In a world that rewards noise, you chose reflection. You chose to slow down, to understand, to feel. And that means more than you can imagine. This space exists for people like you, the quiet thinkers, the ones who notice, the ones who feel deeply but rarely find a place that feels safe to do so. If you find comfort or recognition in these words, consider staying. Subscribe. Not as a number, but as part of a small corner of the internet where we meet here every day to understand the human mind a little better. See, trauma isn't just about the big moments. It's about the thousands of small moments when a developing brain learns whether the world is safe or dangerous, whether emotions are valuable or burdensome, whether they themselves are worthy of care or destined for isolation. And when those lessons are taught through absence rather than presence, through silence rather than acknowledgement, the impact becomes almost impossible to identify later. Because how do you point to something that wasn't there? The most recent neuroscience research has revealed something staggering. Childhood trauma literally rewires the brain, not metaphorically, not symbolically, but physically. Scientists have identified specific neural networks that become disrupted when young minds are forced to navigate emotional deserts. The default mode network, responsible for self-reflection and emotional processing, begins to fragment. The central executive network, which governs decision-making and problem-solving, becomes hypervigilant and dysregulated. These aren't temporary adjustments, they're permanent architectural changes that influence every relationship, every decision, every quiet moment for the rest of that person's life. But here's what makes emotional neglect so particularly insidious. It doesn't announce itself. Physical abuse leaves marks. Sexual abuse creates obvious trauma responses. But emotional neglect operates like a thief in the night, stealing pieces of a child's emotional development so quietly that even the child doesn't realize what's being taken. They adapt. They learn to need less, feel less, expect less. They become experts at reading rooms, managing other people's emotions, anticipating needs. They develop what looks like maturity but is actually a sophisticated survival system. Think about the child who learns that their sadness makes mommy withdraw, or the one who discovers that their excitement is too loud for daddy's headaches, or the little girl who realizes that asking for help makes everyone uncomfortable. These children don't rebel, they don't act out. They disappear into themselves, building internal walls so high that even they forget what's behind them. They become the good kids, the easy ones, the children who never cause problems because they've learned that having needs is the problem. This creates what researchers call a disruption in emotional attunement. The child's nervous system begins operating from a baseline of disconnection. They learn to survive without the fundamental human experience of being truly seen, understood, and valued for who they are rather than what they do. Their brains adapt by becoming hyper-aware of external threats while becoming completely blind to their own internal landscape. They can read a room instantly but couldn't tell you what they're feeling if their life depended on it. Studies show that 28% of young adults carry the invisible scars of childhood trauma, but that number only captures what we can measure, what people are willing to report, what they even recognize as trauma. The truth is likely much higher, because emotional neglect is the trauma that doesn't think it's trauma. It's the wound that learns to call itself strength. It's the child who was praised for being so mature while their developmental needs went completely unmet. What's particularly heartbreaking is how these children often grow into adults who are exceptionally gifted at caring for others, while being completely incapable of caring for themselves. They become the friends everyone calls in crisis, the partners who anticipate every need, the employees who never say no. They excel at emotional labour because it's the only language they've ever known. But beneath that competence lies a profound emptiness, a sense that their own needs are somehow illegitimate, that their own emotions are inconvenient burdens rather than valid human experiences. The research is clear. These early experiences of emotional unavailability don't just create sad memories. They create fundamental alterations in how the brain processes safety, connection, and self-worth. The hippocampus, responsible for memory formation, becomes hypersensitive to threat. The prefrontal cortex, which governs emotional regulation, struggles to develop healthy coping mechanisms. The amygdala, the brain's alarm system, becomes chronically activated, scanning constantly for signs of rejection or abandonment. And this is where the true cruelty of emotional neglect reveals itself. These aren't broken people. They're incredibly resilient humans whose brains adapted brilliantly to impossible circumstances. But those same adaptations that saved them as children begin to suffocate them as adults. They walk through life with nervous systems that interpret love as potential danger, intimacy as a setup for abandonment, and their own needs as evidence of their fundamental inadequacy. Consider what happens in the body of someone whose childhood taught them that emotional expression was unwelcome. Their stress response systems become chronically dysregulated. The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which should help them navigate normal life challenges, instead operates as if every interaction is a potential threat. Cortisol floods their system at inappropriate times. Their heart rate spikes during conversations about feelings. Their digestive system shuts down when they try to express a need. Their body has learned that emotional vulnerability equals danger. But perhaps the most devastating aspect is how these individuals often have no idea this is happening. They've been praised their entire lives for being so together, so independent, so mature. They've built identities around not needing anyone, around being the strong one, around managing everyone else's emotional weather while completely ignoring their own internal storms. They mistake emotional numbness for stability. They confuse hypervigilance for intuition. They believe their inability to rest is evidence of their work ethic rather than a trauma response. The brain scans don't lie. Adults with histories of emotional neglect show distinct patterns of neural activity. Their brains work harder to process positive emotions because they have fewer neural pathways devoted to recognizing safety, joy, or genuine connection. It's not that they can't feel happiness. It's that their brains literally have to work overtime to identify and trust it when it appears. Meanwhile, their threat detection systems remain hyperactive, constantly scanning for signs that they're about to be rejected, abandoned, or found wanting. This creates a particularly cruel paradox. The very people who are most hungry for authentic connection are often the least equipped to recognize it when it arrives. They've spent so many years adapting to emotional scarcity that abundance feels foreign, suspicious, almost dangerous. A partner who consistently shows up emotionally might be met with confusion or even unconscious sabotage, not because they don't want love, but because their nervous system has no template for processing consistent care. The research reveals something even more complex. These individuals often develop what appears to be exceptional emotional intelligence. They can read micro-expressions, anticipate needs, and manage complex emotional situations with remarkable skill. But this isn't emotional intelligence in the healthy sense. It's emotional hypervigilance. It's the survival skill of a child who learned that their safety depended on managing everyone else's emotional state while completely abandoning their own. And here's where it gets particularly insidious. Because they're so skilled at emotional management, because they're so reliable and competent, the world continues to reinforce these patterns. They become the go-to person for everyone else's problems. They attract relationships with people who need fixing, managing, or rescuing. They end up in careers where they're constantly giving of themselves. And all the while, the part of them that was neglected as a child remains frozen in time, still waiting for someone to ask how they're really doing. But here's the truth that changes everything. Recognition is the first step toward reclaiming what was lost. When you can finally see the invisible wounds, when you can name the absence that shaped you, something profound shifts. You begin to understand that the child who learned to disappear still lives within you, still deserves the care they never received. And maybe, just maybe, you can finally give them what they've been waiting for all along. You can learn to hold your own hand in the dark,